The divorce papers had been signed for 3 weeks when I found proof that Marcus had been planning to disappear with my money long before he ever asked me to leave. I wasn't searching for anything. I want to make that clear because it matters. I was doing something completely ordinary, something so small it almost embarrasses me to say it out loud. I was packing the last of his things into a cardboard box. The things he had left behind without explanation, without apology. The way you leave behind objects you no longer need. A spare charger. A book he never finished. 2 dress shirts still in dry cleaning plastic. And at the very bottom of the wardrobe, folded inside a gray jacket I had never once seen him wear, there was a phone. It was face down, screen cracked along one corner. Stone cold dead. I picked it up the way you pick up something that doesn't quite belong to the world you thought you were living in. Slowly. With this strange, detached curiosity, like finding a bone in a garden. I turned it over. I looked at it for a long moment. And then, without saying a word to anyone, I walked to the kitchen, plugged it into my charger, and put the kettle on. I didn't call my sister. I didn't text a friend. I just stood there in the kitchen we had shared for 6 years, listening to the kettle begin to hiss, watching the little charging symbol blink to life on the cracked screen. And I felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as the opposite of surprise. It wasn't shock. It was recognition. The quiet, terrible recognition of a person who realizes they already knew, somewhere deep and unspoken, that something had been hidden from them for a very long time. The kitchen smelled like the coffee I had made an hour earlier, still faintly warm in the pot. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle, the kind that makes dust visible in the air. All those tiny suspended particles just floating there, invisible until the light hits them right. I remember thinking that that was exactly what this felt like. Not a discovery, a shift in the light. The phone needed 11 minutes to charge enough to turn on. I know because I watched the clock. I made my coffee, I leaned against the counter, and I counted those minutes one by one. Not out of impatience, but out of something more deliberate. Something that felt, even then, like the beginning of a decision. When the screen finally lit up, it asked for a 4-digit code. I tried his birthday. Nothing. I tried mine. Nothing. I tried the year we moved into this apartment. Nothing. And then, almost without thinking, I tried the code he used for everything in the early years. Back when he still left his phone on the table during dinner. Back when he had nothing to hide. The screen unlocked. I set my coffee cup down very carefully so it wouldn't make a sound. What I found inside that phone didn't announce itself with anything dramatic. There were no long messages full of confessions, no photographs of another life. Just a banking app, clean and simple, sitting right there on the home screen like it had every right to exist. I opened it. I looked at the account name. Both our names were on it, mine and his. And the balance sitting inside it was large enough to make the room feel slightly tilted. I scrolled back through the transaction history, and what I saw there was not chaos. It was precision. Transfers, consistent and careful. Moving money in a pattern so measured it could only have been deliberate. Timed around moments I now recognized as moments I had been away, or distracted, or simply trusting. Below the banking app, there was a folder of voice memos. Short recordings, his voice, low and businesslike, talking through numbers and timelines with someone he called Joel. Planning, adjusting, referring to my schedule like it was a variable in an equation he had already solved. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not because my legs gave out, but because suddenly the floor felt like the most honest place in the room. If any part of this story made you stop and think, please take a second to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this channel keep going, and there is a lot more of this story still to come. Marcus and I met 9 years before any of this, at a point in my life when I was the kind of person who believed that paying close attention to someone was the same as knowing them. He was introduced to me through a mutual friend at a small gathering. Nothing special, the kind of evening that only becomes significant in hindsight. She was quiet in a way I found interesting. Not shy, not distant, just economical, like a person who had learned that words were more useful when they were chosen carefully. He listened when I spoke. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered details. At the time, I thought that was intimacy. I know now it was something else entirely. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We built a life the way most people do, gradually, then suddenly. A shared apartment, shared routines, a rhythm of mornings and evenings that starts to feel, after enough years, less like a choice and more like the natural order of things. Marcus was good at the visible parts of a relationship, reliable in the ways that other people could see. He remembered anniversaries. He was pleasant at dinner parties. He had a firm handshake and a reputation at work for being the kind of man you could count on. What he was less good at, I began to notice somewhere around year 5, was consistency in the spaces no one else could see. Small things at first. The way he would sometimes pause just a half-second too long before answering a simple question, like he was running the answer through something before releasing it. The way conversations about money, about our savings, about the future would end not in argument, but in a kind of smooth redirection, so subtle that I would finish the conversation feeling somehow satisfied without having received a single concrete answer. I noticed these things. I filed them away in a part of my mind I didn't examine too closely, because examining them would have required me to say out loud something I wasn't yet ready to say. Then the distance started. Not dramatic distance, not the kind that announces itself, the quiet kind. The kind where someone is still physically present, but their attention has moved somewhere else entirely. Somewhere they've decided you don't need to know about. He started traveling more for work, staying late, coming home with the particular brand of tiredness that looks the same as guilt if you know what you're looking for. I told myself reasonable things. The relationships move in cycles, that people go through periods of withdrawal, that I was probably reading into things because I was tired myself, because my own work had been demanding, because it was easier to construct an explanation than to sit with the discomfort of not having one. So I stayed quiet. I watched. I went on living my life in a way that gave him no reason to think I was watching at all. And that, I would later understand, was the most important thing I ever did, even though at the time it felt like weakness. It wasn't patience. It wasn't denial. It was something more precise than either of those things, though I didn't have a name for it yet. The phone on the kitchen floor gave it a name. The account had been open for 3 years. 3 years. While I was sitting across from Marcus at dinner, while I was laughing at his jokes, while I was planning what I thought was our future, he had been quietly moving money into a place he never intended to share with me. I want you to understand what 3 years actually looks like when you start mapping it against your own life. 3 years ago, I had just taken a new position at work that required longer hours and more travel. 3 years ago, Marcus had offered, very kindly, very naturally, to take over managing our shared expenses because I was so busy. I had been grateful. I had actually thanked him. And the whole time, while I was working harder and trusting him more, he had been using that trust the way a carpenter uses a good tool. Efficiently, without sentiment. I sat on that kitchen floor for a long time. The light outside shifted from afternoon gold to something cooler and flatter, and the coffee in my cup went completely cold. And I just kept scrolling through those transactions, reading the dates, cross-referencing them in my head with moments I could actually remember. A weekend I spent visiting my mother out of town. A work trip that kept me away for 5 days. A long holiday weekend when Marcus told me he was going to visit an old friend, and I had stayed home alone, reading books and thinking how nice it was to have the apartment to myself. Every single significant transfer lined up with a moment I had been somewhere else. He hadn't been careless. That was the part that sat in my chest like a cold stone. He had been meticulous, patient. He had mapped my absences the way a navigator maps wind patterns, and he had moved between them without leaving a ripple. And the voice memos, those short, business-like recordings where he talked through numbers with Joel in a tone so calm it could have been a grocery list. Those told me something even more unsettling than the money itself. This had been planned from a distance, designed. There was someone else involved, someone who understood enough about finance to help structure what I was looking at. And that someone had been sitting on the other end of a phone while my marriage was still, technically, intact. I closed the banking app. I sat very still. And then I did the only thing that made any sense to me in that moment. I opened the voice memos, pressed play on the very first one, and listened to my husband's voice explain, in careful, measured detail, exactly how he intended to leave me with nothing. The recording was 4 minutes and 12 seconds long. I listened to it 3 times. By the time I stood up from that kitchen floor, something in me had reorganized itself. Not broken, not even cracked. Just rearranged into a shape that was quieter and sharper and considerably less willing to be managed. I washed my coffee cup. I unplugged the phone. I wrapped it carefully in a cloth and placed it at the bottom of my own bag, underneath my wallet and my keys, where it would stay until I decided exactly what to do with it. Then I called Diane. My sister Diane is 4 years older than me, and she has worked in financial auditing for most of her adult life. She is the kind of person who reads contracts for enjoyment and keeps receipts for things most people throw away the same day. We are not alike in obvious ways. Where I tend to process things slowly, working through them in layers, Diane processes them immediately and completely, the way a machine reads a barcode. Fast, precise, final. When she answered, her voice was warm and ordinary. She asked how the packing was going. I told her I had found something, and that I needed her to look at it without asking me how I was feeling about it first. There was a short pause on her end, the specific pause of a person recalibrating, and then she said simply, "Send it." I photographed every screen on that phone. The account summary, the transaction history going back 3 years, the business registration I found buried in the documents folder, a small company with a name I didn't recognize, registered at an address I had never been to, with my signature on the founding documents, a signature I had never written. I sent everything to Diane in a single message. Then I sat on the couch and waited, listening to the sound of the street outside, the low and indifferent noise of a world that had no idea what was happening in this apartment. She called back in under an hour. Her voice, when she spoke, had that particular flatness that Diane gets when something is serious. Not cold, just stripped of everything unnecessary. "Sarah," she said, "this is not a mistake. This is not something he did once and panicked about." She paused. "This has been running for at least 3 years, and whoever helped him set it up knew exactly what they were doing." I already knew, but hearing it out loud, in my sister's voice, in that specific tone, made it real in a way that the screen of that cracked phone hadn't quite managed. And then she said the thing that changed the direction of everything that followed. She said, "The signature on that business document. I need you to look at it very carefully, because if it's what I think it is, this isn't just about the money anymore." The signature on that business document was not even close to mine. I know my own handwriting. I have known it for as long as I have known anything. The slight leftward lean on the capital letters, the way my S never quite closes at the top, the particular pressure I put on a pen that makes the downstrokes a little heavier than the upstrokes. That signature had none of it. It was a copy, in the loosest possible sense, the way a cheap painting copies a masterpiece, recognizable from a distance, but completely wrong up close. Someone had studied my signature well enough to approximate it, but not well enough to replicate it. And whoever that someone was, they had used it to register a business in my name, bind me legally to a financial structure I knew nothing about, and do it all without ever needing me in the same room. I pulled out every document I had ever signed that I could find in the apartment: lease agreements, bank forms, old contracts from years back that I had kept in a folder in the bottom drawer of the desk. I laid them out on the dining table side by side, and I photographed each one. Then I sent the photos to Diane alongside the image of the forged signature. Her response came back in 11 minutes. She wrote one sentence: "We need a lawyer, not just an accountant." I sat with that for a moment. The apartment around me was very still, the kind of still that feels active rather than empty, like the air itself is paying attention. I could hear the faint sound of traffic several floors below, the distant rhythm of a city moving through its evening, completely unaware that in this particular apartment, on this particular table, the last 9 years of my life were laid out in paper and photographs, and none of them were what I had believed them to be. Here is the thing about discovering that someone has forged your signature. It moves the situation into an entirely different category. What I had found on that phone could have been explained, at least in theory. Marcus could have constructed some version of events, some story about a business investment that went wrong, about intentions he never acted on, about plans that existed only on paper. People explain things. People apologize. People ask for second chances, and sometimes they even mean it. But a forged signature cannot be explained. It is a decision. A cold, deliberate, premeditated decision made by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. And it told me something about Marcus that I realized, sitting at that table, I had always sensed, but never let myself name directly. He did not see me as a partner. He had never seen me as a partner. He saw me as a resource. And resources, in his particular way of thinking, existed to be managed, arranged, and when the time was right, quietly redirected. I was not angry. I want to be precise about that, because anger would have been the wrong thing to feel in that moment. Anger is loud, and it makes you visible. And visibility, I was already beginning to understand, was the last thing I needed right now. What I felt was something closer to the sensation of stepping out of a building you've lived in for years and seeing its exterior for the very first time. All those years on the inside, and you never once thought to look at the shape of the thing from the outside. I closed the folder. I stacked the documents, and I went to bed at a reasonable hour, because whatever came next was going to require me to be sharp, and sharp required sleep. The lawyer's name was Ruth, and she came recommended by a colleague of Diane's who described her as someone who does not lose. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, small and deliberately unimpressive from the outside. The kind of place that doesn't need to announce itself because its reputation already does that work. The waiting area smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, and the chairs were the kind of functional that suggests the people who sit in them are not there to be comfortable. They are there to get something done. Ruth herself was perhaps 60, with short gray hair and reading glasses she kept on the end of her nose in a way that made her look perpetually on the verge of catching you in an inconsistency. She shook my hand once, firmly, and then she sat down, opened a legal pad, and said, "Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." So I did. I told her about the phone, the account, the voice memos, the business registration, the forged signature. I laid the documents on her desk in the same order I had laid them on my dining table the night before. She did not interrupt. She did not react visibly to any of it. She simply listened, made notes in a handwriting so small it was nearly illegible from where I sat, and occasionally pushed her glasses up with one finger. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. She looked at her notes. She looked at the documents. She looked at me. Then she said something I was not prepared for. She said, "The storage unit registered under the name Joel Whitman. Do you know that name?" I felt something tighten in my chest. Joel. The name from the voice memos, the calm, business-like voice on the other end of those recordings. I said, "Yes." "How do you know about a storage unit?" She slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward me. It was a property registration document, recent, with Joel Whitman's name printed clearly at the top. And listed as a secondary contact with full access rights was Marcus. But it was the address of the storage unit that stopped my breath completely, because it was 4 streets from our apartment. 4 streets. I had walked past that building hundreds of times. Inside that storage unit, according to Ruth, was enough documentation to rewrite everything I thought I understood about the last 3 years of my marriage. She had not been inside it herself. She was careful to make that clear, precise in the way she always was about the boundaries of what she knew versus what she suspected. But she had a contact, someone she described only as a person who pays attention to these things professionally. And that person had connected the unit to Joel Whitman through a paper trail that was, in her words, sloppy in the way that people get sloppy when they believe no one is looking. Marcus and Joel had believed no one was looking. That was the miscalculation at the center of everything they had built. I asked Ruth how she had known to look for the storage unit at all. She pushed her glasses up, glanced at her notes, and said that when someone structures a financial arrangement the way Marcus had, moving money in small, timed increments into a jointly named account while simultaneously registering a business using a forged signature, there is almost always a physical location involved. Somewhere to keep the things that cannot exist digitally. Paper records, backup documentation, objects that have value but cannot be easily traced through a bank statement. She said she had seen this pattern before, not often, but enough times to know where to look. I sat with that for a moment. The idea that what Marcus had done followed a pattern, that it was not even original, that somewhere in Ruth's years of experience, she had already seen a version of this, had already learned its shape and its logic and its weak points. There was something almost clarifying about that. It meant that what I was dealing with was not some impossible, unprecedented thing. It was a known structure. And known structures, Ruth had said in our very first meeting, can always be dismantled. She told me she wanted to move carefully but quickly. Carefully because any misstep at this stage could complicate the legal position. Quickly because the longer the business registration and the account remained active, the more time Marcus and Joel had to move things further out of reach. She said she needed one thing from me before she could take the next step. She needed me to not contact Marcus, not a message, not a call, not even a brief, ordinary text about something unrelated. Nothing. She needed him to have no indication that anything had changed, because the moment he suspected I knew, the clock on everything we had already found would start running in the wrong direction. I told her I understood. She looked at me steadily over her glasses and said, "I need you to be certain, because the impulse to confront is very human and very understandable, and in this situation, it will cost you everything." I told her I was certain, and I was, because by that point, I had already understood something important. The version of me that would have confronted Marcus in anger, that would have called him the moment I found that phone and demanded an explanation. That version had dissolved somewhere between the kitchen floor and the dining table the night before. What was left was quieter, more patient, and considerably more dangerous to him than anger ever could have been. I walked home from Ruth's office along the street that passed 4 blocks from the storage unit. I did it deliberately. I walked slowly, looking at the building as I passed it. An ordinary low structure with a metal door and a keypad entry. The kind of place you walk past 100 times and never once wonder about. I did not stop. I did not slow my pace. I just looked at it, the way you look at something you now understand, and kept walking. That evening, Marcus sent me a message. Brief, neutral. The kind of message designed to sound like it came from a reasonable person managing a difficult situation. He said he was planning to come by at the end of the week to collect the remaining boxes, and that he hoped we could keep things civil. I read it once, set my phone face down on the counter, and did not reply. The next morning, I did something that had nothing to do with lawyers or documents or financial accounts. I drove to the neighborhood where the storage unit was registered, and I sat in my car half a block away, not watching the building exactly, just present in its general direction, because sometimes you need to be physically close to the thing that changed everything in order to understand what it actually means. I had been sitting there for perhaps 20 minutes when a man walked out of the building through the metal door. He was perhaps 50, solidly built, in a dark jacket, carrying a flat cardboard envelope under one arm. He did not look around. He walked to a gray car parked at the curb, got in, and drove away without any sign of urgency. I had never seen that man before in my life, but I knew, with a certainty that settled in my stomach like cold water, that I had just seen Joel Whitman for the first time. I took a photograph of the car as it pulled away. The plate was clearly visible. My hands were completely steady. I sent the photograph to Ruth with a single line beneath it. "I think I just saw him." Her reply came back in under 2 minutes. It said, "Do not go back there." And then, after a short pause, a second message arrived. "But good. This is very good." I put my phone away and started the engine. And as I pulled out onto the road, I realized that for the first time since I had found that phone in Marcus's jacket, I was not reacting to something he had done. I was moving ahead of it. And that difference, small as it might sound, changed everything about how the next few days were going to feel. Ruth called me that same evening. Her voice had a different quality to it. Not urgent exactly, but alive in a way that told me something had shifted. She said her contact had confirmed the identity of the man I photographed. It was Joel Whitman. And Joel Whitman, it turned out, was not simply a friend helping Marcus structure a financial arrangement. He was a former colleague from a company Marcus had worked at years before I knew him. And between them, according to documents Ruth's contact had now seen inside that storage unit, they had run a version of this same scheme once before. A different person, a different account, a different forged signature, but the same logic, the same patience, the same careful timing. I sat down when she told me that. Slowly, the way you sit when your legs have decided before your brain has. Marcus had done this before, to someone else, before me. Ruth let that land for a moment, then said, "Which means this is no longer just a civil matter. I have already been in contact with the appropriate authorities. There will be a formal process now, separate from your divorce proceedings, and it will move on its own timeline. What I need you to understand is that your position in all of this just became significantly stronger." I asked her what I should do. She said, for now, nothing. Let the process work. And when Marcus comes to collect those boxes at the end of the week, let him. Be ordinary. Give him no reason to change his plans or contact Joel or move anything before we are ready. I said I could do that. She said she believed me. And then she said something I had not expected. She said, "Whoever you were before you found that phone, Sarah, you are handling this better than most people manage in situations that are far less complicated than yours." I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in the quiet apartment and I thought about the other person, the one before me. The one who had gone through some version of this and whose experience had apparently not been enough to stop Marcus from deciding to do it again. I thought about whether they had known, whether they had found something the way I had found the phone, and what they had done with it. And I thought about the fact that Marcus had looked at what happened before, whatever consequence had or hadn't followed, and had decided it was worth trying again. That told me more about him than 3 years of living together ever had. It told me that he had never once believed he would be caught. Not really. Not completely. And that certainty, that comfortable, unexamined certainty, was exactly where Ruth and I were going to meet him. Marcus showed up 3 days early. I heard the key in the lock before I heard anything else. That specific metallic sound that used to mean something ordinary and now landed in my chest like a small alarm. He still had a key. Of course he did. We had never discussed that particular detail in the week since the papers were signed, and I had not raised it because raising it would have suggested I had a reason to. I set down what I was holding and stood very still in the middle of the living room. And by the time the door opened, I had arranged my face into something that looked like mild surprise and nothing more. He looked different from the last time I had seen him. Slightly thinner, maybe, or maybe it was just that I was looking at him differently now, the way you look at a building once you understand it was constructed on the wrong foundation. He was carrying a bag, a large one, and he moved through the doorway with that familiar ease that had always read as confidence and now read as something else entirely. "Hey," he said, "I hope this is okay. I managed to get a free afternoon." I said it was fine. I gestured toward the boxes stacked near the hallway, the ones I had prepared exactly as Ruth had advised, everything in order, nothing missing. Nothing that would give him any reason to look more carefully at anything else in the apartment. He glanced at the boxes, then at me, and I watched that old habit of his surface, the quick scan, the reading of the room, the search for information I might be giving away without realizing it. I gave him nothing. He started moving boxes toward the door, and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and watched him work. We talked the way people talk when they are performing normality for an audience of each other. The weather, a mutual acquaintance, something vague about the neighborhood. His voice was careful, light, paced in a way that I recognized now as deliberate. The vocal equivalent of walking across ice and testing each step before committing weight to it. After the third box, he stopped in the doorway and looked at me. He said, "You seem good." I said I was getting there. He nodded, slowly, as if the answer required processing. And then he said something that told me everything I needed to know about where his head was. He said, "I just want you to know I never wanted it to end badly." I looked at him. I held the look for exactly long enough. Then I said, "I know, Marcus." And that was it. That was the whole of it. He finished the boxes. He returned the key without me asking, setting it on the counter with a small, deliberate click, and he left. The door closed behind him. I listened to his footsteps in the hallway until they faded completely. Then I picked up my phone and sent Ruth a single word. "Done." Her reply came back immediately. "Good. Tomorrow morning, be available." I set the phone down and finished my tea in the quiet apartment, and I noticed something that I had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter than either of those things. The specific calm of a person who has done exactly what was required of them without allowing anything unnecessary to spill over the edges. 2 days after Marcus came for his boxes, Ruth called me at 9 in the morning and told me that Joel Whitman had been formally interviewed by investigators the previous afternoon. She said he had arrived with a lawyer, which told her he had known this was coming, had perhaps been expecting it for longer than Marcus realized. She said the interview had been, in her careful professional language, productive. I asked what that meant. She said it meant that when people like Joel are presented with a clear picture of what investigators already know, they tend to make decisions that protect themselves first. She said she did not yet know the specific content of what Joel had told them, but that the storage unit had been formally accessed that morning under the authority of the investigation, and that what was found inside it was, by all accounts, considerably more detailed than anyone had anticipated. paper records going back further than 3 years, documentation of the previous scheme, the one involving the person before me. Correspondence between Marcus and Joel that laid out, in their own words, exactly what they had been doing and why. I stood at the window while she talked, looking out at the street below, at the ordinary morning moving past in its ordinary way. A woman walking a dog, a delivery van double parked with its hazard lights blinking. The sky a pale, washed-out blue that promised nothing dramatic. Ruth said, "Marcus was contacted this morning. Formally. He will have received the notification before 10. I asked her how she thought he would respond. She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone selecting their words with care. She said, "I think he will be very surprised." Because people who plan as carefully as Marcus did tend to believe their planning makes them safe. And the discovery that it does not is, in my experience, genuinely shocking to them. I thought about that. I thought about Marcus standing somewhere, perhaps in the apartment he had moved into after we separated, perhaps on his way to work, reading a formal notification on his phone with that expression I had seen in our living room just 2 days ago. That careful, controlled expression, and watching it change in real time as the words reached him, and he understood that the structure he had spent 3 years building had already been taken apart, quietly and completely, before he ever thought to check whether it was still standing. I did not feel sorry for him. I want to be honest about that. I tried to locate something like pity, and I could not find it, and I decided that was acceptable. There is a version of this story where the right response is to feel sad about what a person chose to become. I am sure that version exists, but it was not mine. What I felt was simpler and more precise. I felt like someone who had been handed a set of coordinates and had navigated to exactly the right place in exactly the right amount of time without losing a single thing that actually belonged to her. Ruth said she would be in touch as the process moved forward. She said my role at this point was to continue doing what I had been doing, which was nothing visible, nothing reactive, nothing that placed me inside the story in any way other than as the person to whom something had been done. I thanked her. I said I understood. And then I said something that surprised even me a little. I said, "Ruth, did the person before me, the one from the previous scheme, did they ever find out what happened? Did they know it was resolved?" There was a pause on her end. Then she said, "I don't know, but I can find out." I told her I would appreciate that, because it mattered to me in a way I could not have predicted when this all began, that whoever that person was, they would eventually know that the pattern Marcus had built his confidence on had finally collapsed. Not because of luck, not because of a mistake on his part, but because someone had paid attention. Here is what I know now that I did not know when I was sitting on that kitchen floor with a cracked phone in my hand and 3 years of transactions on its screen. Betrayal of the kind Marcus chose is not a sudden thing. It does not arrive one morning fully formed. It is built, slowly, out of small decisions made in private, each one slightly larger than the last, each one depending on the assumption that no one is watching carefully enough to notice the pattern. And that assumption, more than anything else, is where it breaks down. Because people do notice, they just do not always know what to do with what they see. What I did was simple, even if it did not feel simple at the time. I paid attention. I did not react before I understood. I found people who knew more than I did, and I listened to them. I stayed quiet when every instinct told me to speak. And I trusted that the truth, once properly documented and placed in the right hands, would do what truth does when it is given room to move. I am not telling you this story because I think I handled it perfectly. I made choices in those days that kept me up at night, that I turned over and examined from every angle, that I am still not entirely sure were right in every detail. But they were mine. Every single one of them was mine. And after 9 years of living inside a story that had been quietly written around me without my knowledge, that felt like the most important thing of all. The apartment is different now. Not because I redecorated or moved the furniture or did any of the things people do when they are performing a fresh start. It is different because the air in it belongs entirely to me. Every sound in it, every silence. I walk through it in the mornings, and I do not feel the absence of something. I feel the presence of space. And space, it turns out, is something you do not fully understand the value of until someone has spent years trying to take it from you without you noticing. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. If you found out that someone close to you, someone you trusted completely, had been carefully managing your perception of reality for years, not through cruelty, but through patience and planning, would you want to know the full truth all at once? Or would you rather it came to you slowly, in pieces, the way it came to me? Think about that, and leave your answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to know. If this story stayed with you, if any part of it felt familiar or made you think differently about the people you trust, please leave a like and subscribe. It means more than you know, and there are more stories like this one still to come.